Do you like Dark Souls 2? The question answered without ever being asked. The game is simply regarded as a disgrace and an insult to the series without even a second thought. I am 90% sure I enjoyed this game, but I am also 100% sure that I fucking hate this game. You bitch. Now let me out of this goddamn poison bullshit. Dark Souls 2 is frustrating in a way that other Fromsoft games are not. The other games have had unfair parts, but mostly stick to a tough but fair mantra for the majority of their playthrough, whereas Dark Souls 2 seems deliberately designed to be annoying, aggravating, and sometimes just completely broken. I still had a blast playing DS2, but I also wanted to break my controller more than any game I have ever played. Despite this and what many other YouTubers say about this game,
I like Dark Souls 2.
You fucking idiot. They had 100 ideas, 90 of them are shit, 5 of them are okay, 5 of them are great.
Like, I don't know why so many people struggle with accepting this obvious fact that Dark Souls 2 is a bad game.
there is still a lot of fun to be had and many positives to be celebrated. Surprisingly, it is 10 years old today. How does it hold up? How does it feel compared to the other From Software games, and should you give it a go today? Let's dive into the deep end and discuss the ins and outs of the black sheep of the From Software catalog. This is Dark Souls 2, 10 years later. The biggest problem in my opinion with DS2 is the level design. I know all Soulsborne games are a bit confusing, but holy shit, I had to look online where to go next after almost every area. I expect to have to do this a bit with my tiny brain, but every area felt like it led to a dead end where you had to go back to somewhere you'd already been before because now you had done something that allowed you to progress further in that direction. This is the first point in a long list I'm going to be dubbing things the devs did to intentionally make this game annoying. I imagine the devs got into their heads that people liked their first 2 games because they were frustrating, so they intentionally designed Dark Souls 2 in the way that they did. Let's contrast this completely strange world design with that of its successor. Dark Souls 3 was essentially one very long corridor with a little bit of backtracking, but for the most part I knew where to go next as the levels just kept going from point to point. I know people like a more open world with more choices on where to go next, but Dark Souls 3 level design did something phenomenal. It made you feel like you were choosing where to go even if you weren't. The game would loop back around on itself and create numerous shortcuts, but you always felt as though you were making progress. Dark Souls 2 shortcuts almost felt like they weren't shortcuts at all. You fight the same enemies over and over regardless. The amount of backtracking with keys to open doors and newly acquired items just felt like a chore, and honestly, I personally don't like this kind of gameplay. The second item on the intentionally annoy the players list is make the areas themselves as frustrating as possible. Like, what the hell is this place? Why is this place completely dark and confusing? And worst of all, these f***ing cats here in the Iron Keep. This is the worst level in the game, my friends. I died here so many times that the archers started to despawn. Not to mention the insane aggro distance the enemies will chase you for. In other games, if you want to run through an area, you can. But in Dark Souls 2, you have to fight the same enemies over and over again in order to get to the boss, or the sheer amount of enemies and archers chasing you will eventually overwhelm you and kill you regardless. Also, if you somehow make it to the boss door, you're not untargetable during the first half of the animation and can be knocked out of it. So, yay! Another one for the list. And to top it all off, the piece de la resistance, I think I said that right, even with my cold. Imagine this, you've just died 15 times in a row, either trying to get to the boss room or during your battle with the boss. Your healing is running low, but you finally get the killing blow on your foe. There's no respite though. You know those 9 enemies you ran past to get to the boss without using all your healing? Yeah, well they're sitting directly outside the boss door because they didn't lose aggro. No, the goon squad rolls on in to do what the boss failed to do. Once you kill a boss, there's no bonfire with no indication of when the next one will be. You don't know whether to homeward bone back to the bonfire to return to Majula to level up with your newly acquired souls, or to carry on to the next bonfire and risk dying. Knowing that if you homeward bone, you're going to have to run through this level of irritating enemies all over again to get back to where you were. And one final negative about the level design before I move on to more positive things, the enemy placement in this game is without a doubt the most annoying thing in this game. Archers spammed along walls you can't get to yet, or many hard to defeat enemies placed right next to each other, or along escape routes. As I said, Iron Keep is the most annoying area in this game for sure. This room here, you enter and there are enemies on you from miles away. They just keep running at you. And then you've got archers with these giant arrows that stagger you, hitting you non-stop. It is so irritating. Dark Souls combat is undoubtedly better in one-on-one scenarios. It is like this in all the games, and it's just worse when faced with many enemies at once. I don't mind the odd gank or multiple enemies section, but this game just boils my piss. Especially as someone who is playing as a strength build who took a long time to swing and used a lot of stamina doing so. I felt constantly like I had no time to swing my overly large weapon for fear of being pelted with arrows or stunned by enemy attacks. Not to mention the amount of stats I had to waste on adaptability that could have gone into endurance, but we'll talk about that pile of poop later on. Hope that load of rambling made sense. With all that said, there are mechanics which make this problem a bit easier. If you kill a certain enemy enough times, i.e. you died and defeated them so many times, they will eventually stop spawning altogether, meaning you no longer have to waste precious healing or time defeating them on your run back to where you died. This obviously makes it easier for players who are really banging their head against a brick wall trying to complete an area. I feel like this system relieved some of the frustration from the infuriating level design. However, it comes with one obvious downside: farming. Farming is going to be much weaker if the enemy despawns after you have killed them a bunch. There is a solution for this, but I don't think it really solves the problem. You can burn an item called the Bonfire Aesthetic to upgrade an area to the New Game Plus difficulty, which respawns all the enemies that you have overkilled before. However, farming is usually done by people who are struggling and need more stats to complete the next stage of the game, and by making the area more difficult, that kinda defeats the purpose. It probably sounds like I really hate this game, but it is simply easier to talk about what's wrong with a game than what's right about a game. I will, however, try my best to give both sides of the coin here. Having said that the levels are frustratingly designed and shorten my temper to even smaller than my penis, yes, very little, but the addicting gameplay loop from the other games is still present here. I still got addicted to getting better, learning my opponent's moves, leveling up to get stronger, to eventually conquer a challenge that stood in my path. That is still unbelievably fun, and the rush you get once you finally win is still the rewarding mechanic it has always been. I think the genre in which the game is created is still the main pull of this title. Dark Souls 2 has a lot of frustrating features sitting atop a foundation that is incredibly gratifying and ignites the sense of achievement that no other genre has yet done for me. So despite the pile of castle-sized shit that's on top of it, I still really enjoyed the gameplay, as even that pile of feces couldn't stop Fromsoft's foundation of a pure endorphin rush that only the struggle of a Soulsborne game can create. So, the boss fights. The actual boss fights are definitely the weakest in the series. Keeping in mind I have not played Dark Souls 1 or Demon Souls yet, but from what I've heard, this sentiment rings true. Compared to the best boss fights I've ever had in a game from Dark Souls 3 and the spectacle of the Elden Ring bosses, Dark Souls 2 just fails terribly in boss fights. They are often easier than the areas that led up to them, making the real boss fight the runbacks. I defeated many bosses first or second time, and for me, that's a real shame. They didn't have huge movesets to learn or great spectacles to endure. No, they all felt fairly similar with predictable timings and attacks that I could predict even before I'd even seen them attack once. I was dodging attacks first time and easily, with the exception of a few bosses which usually just felt cheap and unfair. Unlike in Dark Souls 3, where you knew you just had to get better to beat a hard boss, DS2 boss deaths just felt like you either got lucky or you didn't, and you usually died to some really dumb attack. The only time I struggled with the boss was when they were genuinely unfair or just fucking stupid. Take Mytha, the Baneful Queen boss fight for example. The runback is filled with difficult to run away from enemies, poison, hidden enemies that seem to do something slightly different every time. Frustrating. Once you finally make it to the boss fight, usually having lost some health and Estus, you are faced with a boss arena that's floor is completely covered in poison. You have to constantly be removing the poison while also healing and paying attention to the boss's normal attacks, which still do a decent amount of damage considering the floor is goddamn poison, all while finding the time to do damage to her. So already we have some of the most hated parts of Soulsborne games all rolled into one. Difficult runback, poison floors, and an unrelenting boss fight that constantly has you using items instead of actually playing the game. I didn't get the rush after this boss, I just felt relieved to never have to do it again. And of course, my biggest fans that I had just run past to get there broke into the room immediately to congratulate me on my success. Luckily, I killed her before my anti-poison items ran out, but I imagine for players struggling more than me, they would be really upset having to go farm these items after dying a few more times than I did. Weapons in DS2 are okay. There's a lot of them. I wouldn't say I was really happy with many of them. Once I found the greatsword, nothing else I tried really felt as good, except for maybe the dragon's tooth, which I had to unequip to take down some of the faster enemies. I think it's my fault that I didn't experiment much, but the greatsword just did everything I wanted to, and nothing ever felt quite as good. I would love to have tried maybe a different build at some stage. I don't really feel like I can effectively speak to this part of the game, as I was kinda stubbornly stuck to my greatsword. Can you blame me? I just wanted to bonk people with a big sword. I have been trying out the curved dragon sword, and you know what? It's pretty cool as well. While initially avoiding the spaceship-sized elephant in the room called agility, I want to ignore that for the time being. The leveling system present in every Soulsborne game is of course in DS2. Essentially kill things to earn souls. If you die, those souls are lost and dropped on the ground, giving you one chance to collect them. If you die and fail to pick them up, they are lost forever. This mechanic is core to the genre and makes every encounter feel intense and meaningful, making every death matter. Dying is a huge part of the gameplay loop. It's essentially fail and learn from your mistakes over and over again until you finally learn enough to overcome the challenge. A rewarding system I never understood or thought I would love until I got hooked on this genre for the first time when I played Dark Souls 3. So the souls are both an XP mechanic and a currency, which you must use to purchase items, weapons, and levels themselves. Personally, I like this system a lot. It means you can slowly build up the perfect character to how you like, improving only the stats you require for the build you want to run with. I just want to quickly mention the hollowing effect in DS2. That means every time you die, you lose a bit of your max HP, and you also look fucking disgusting. I don't like this system at all. It punishes you in an unfair way in a game that is all about dying and trying again, to learn through repetition. You can reverse this with an in-game item, the human effigy, that can drop from enemies and can be found in the world. But what happens to someone who runs out of these things early on, and is stuck with a dwindling HP bar as they are just trying to get better at the game? I tended to use a human effigy every 3 or 4 deaths to remove the effect, and I always had enough to carry on the game. But I don't see what this added to the experience other than another annoyance which I had to add to my list. The one big problem with Dark Souls 2 version of the stat leveling up mechanic is the aforementioned agility, a stat increased by the adaptability option on the upgrade screen. Now what is given to the player for free in other Dark Souls games is now something you must level up. This makes it feel like a wasted investment of points, but is ultimately needed if you want to get anywhere in this game. This is one of the biggest offenders on the list of irritating dev decisions for sure. Agility is a stat that reduces the amount of time it takes to complete certain actions, like using consumables, and also increases the iframes you have while dodging. Iframes for the uninformed are the frames in the roll or dodge animation in which you are essentially unable to be hit with new attacks or abilities. I've read that you must get agility to at least 99 for it to feel like the other games. So you start off with a dodge that doesn't feel like the other games and is a steep learning curve that is just unneeded. The worst part is how slow you use items or sip from your Estus flask at the beginning of the game. You almost get hit every time you try to use this. Honestly, just a unanimously hated stat that has never reappeared in any game since. Basically, it feels like you're throwing your hard-earned souls down the toilet just to achieve something you should already have from the get-go. Apart from the agility, the game systems that are in place are as great as they are in the other games. I also just want to quickly add that there are some super janky hitboxes in this game that you don't see as much in the other Fromsoft games. If you're enjoying this video, please hit that like button. It really helps me out. Thank you. Let's talk about an obvious one. Graphically, it doesn't stand up to the other giants from 2014 with the likes of Far Cry 4, Shadow of Mordor, Assassin's Creed Unity, which all have much higher fidelity. But as I've said before, fidelity is not really very important to making a good game. Sure, it's nice, but art direction is the infinitely more important factor. The best example is Elden Ring, also a Fromsoft game, where it has very low fidelity compared to the other games released that year, but its art direction is simply stunning, and it's one of the most beautiful games ever made despite its low fidelity graphics. So how does Dark Souls 2 hold up in this regard? Honestly, not very well. There are parts such as Majula and the mini castles that litter the world that all feel and look pretty good, but for each castle there's a dark boring cave, a grungy never-ending hallway, well this fucking bullshit place. I want to quickly touch on the story of this game. Honestly, like most Fromsoft games, I haven't got the faintest idea what is going on. I would have to watch a lore video to understand it. If you want to do it yourself, the story is told through dialogue and item descriptions, but are usually intentionally vague. Now, I am a huge lover of story-based games, but the gameplay loop is so addictive in these games that the story is irrelevant and only serves as a backdrop to the great feats you are trying to achieve, and I am completely okay with that. I have said many negative things so far about Dark Souls 2, but it truly doesn't matter. I still enjoyed this game a ton, I think. Although this may be the worst of the back catalogue from Fromsoft's mainline games, that doesn't make it bad. It has many bad things about it, but it has such a solid foundation that no matter how many terrible building blocks are placed on top of it, it stands tall as a fun and entertaining game. It's like being the worst F1 racer, or the person who comes last in an Olympic race. You still made it to the top of your field and are incredible. I will probably never replay DS2 because it's so frustrating and there's a lot of better options, but that doesn't mean I didn't enjoy my journey, and I would recommend people who have been avoiding it to give it a try despite its rough reputation. Just be prepared for a bit of a struggle trying to understand why on earth the developers tried to make it as frustrating as possible. Want to see my first few hours of Dark Souls 2 condensed into a funny compilation of fails? Then click the video on screen now.